just delighted to be here with the wonderful and one and only Joe Cirincione. He needs no introduction, of course. Joe, I don't know anyone who knows more about the nuclear policy space than Joe. He got his start as a congressional staffer on the Armed Services Committee. He's been an advisor on nuclear strategy to numerous presidents and presidential candidates. He's worked across government and very high level positions in the non-governmental sector, including as director of nonproliferation at Carnegie, VP for the for American Progress, and president, of course, of Plowshares for many years, where he's just really led the charge on these issues. He's also the author of several really impactful books in this space. I really recommend that everyone go read Nuclear Nightmares, Securing the World Before It's Too Late. One question I have for you, Joe, is it still not too late? Is it still not too late? But we'll get to that. But we're here today. So I'm Annalise Riles. I'm a professor of international law at Northwestern University. I'm also an anthropologist by training, and I wrote my doctoral dissertation many years ago about the nuclear free and independent Pacific movement, which is probably not as well known in the US, but very important, led to the nuclear free zone in the Pacific. And now I work in Japan, especially in Nagasaki, quite a lot. Spent a lot of time there as a peace correspondent for the city of Nagasaki, supporting them in their efforts to engage the global community on behalf of Hibakusha. So we wanted to talk with you today about a number of things that are happening. One is, of course, today is the anniversary of the coming into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, so we'll get to that. But we also wanted to talk with you about some ideas that Joe has that I think are just really important about the changing nature of the political system and the fact that with the rise of authoritarianism, the whole nuclear security regime looks very different. So that's a lot to talk about, Joe, right? I mean, we got a lot to talk about.
Okay, so let's. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much for getting this going and for inviting me to participate in this. Before we get going, can you tell us just a little more about what you do in Nagasaki, what that position is called?
So I am a peace correspondent. They have a handful of us. The most famous one is Yoko Ono. And our job is really to do everything we can to support the efforts of the city. So most every year I attend the ceremonies on the day of the bombing. I organize groups of students, scholars, research projects in Nagasaki and around cities, peace building efforts. When the mayor of Nagasaki comes to the UN, I support him and his delegation whatever way I can, including placing op-eds, translating, cooking dinner, whatever it is that they need. And really, it's just an honor for me to be in their presence and to learn from the folks who've seen all this firsthand.
Wonderful. That's great. Well, it's a pleasure. So we're going to have some complementary experiences here to bounce off of as we
Wonderful.
discuss it. So let's set the stage. Okay, so where are we? What's going on right now? And we got to back up just a little bit because we're coming off of more than 20 years of nuclear reductions. When people remember back in the East, when Ronald Reagan, who entered office as someone in favor of a big nuclear buildup, left office as the greatest arms control president in American history because he and Mikhail Gorbachev, the head of the Soviet Union, right before it collapsed, agreed that it was insane to think about winning a nuclear war, and we should never start a nuclear war, and that the American and the Soviet stockpiles were way too big for any rational military use. So they agreed to start cutting their arsenals. Each had about 30,000 nuclear weapons. And that started a steady period of presidents, mostly Republican presidents, but Republican and Democratic presidents, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, then Barack Obama, steadily decreasing the nuclear arsenals. And we went down from about almost 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world in the 1980s down to about 12,000 nuclear weapons now, most of them owned by the United States and Russia still. About 90% of all the weapons in the world are held by those two nuclear superpowers. And the problem is we've flatlined. We have stopped. There have been no new reduction agreements since the New START agreement was approved by the Senate back in 2010. And there's been no new nuclear agreement since then. So 15, 16 years without a new treaty. And people were sort of sanguine about that. That, well, we didn't get around to it. So and in fact, the last treaty that's remaining, the New START treaty, expires in just a couple of weeks. Beginning in the middle of February, it expires. And there's no sign, and I talked to a couple of experts just to make sure about this, there's no sign that that's going to be renewed or that Russia and the United States will reach any kind of informal agreement to stay within those limits. So that means in the middle of February, there will be no limits anymore on U.S. or Russian stockpiles, and they can build up as much as they want. There'll be the end of inspections of each other's stockpiles, and they'll be ending a process that began in 1972 when Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger negotiated the first arms limitation treaty, SALT, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. Well, that process is now over. There's no rational reason for this to be over. There's no need for the United States to deploy more than 1,550 nuclear weapons, which is what we have deployed right now, plus an equal number held in reserve, plus a couple of thousand waiting for disassembly, and for the Russians to have that equal number. There's no reason to have these thousands of nuclear weapons, but a combination of ideology, where many people in the United States have been against arms control treaties since the beginning. Since Strom Thurmond railed against Richard Nixon's policies, people felt that we shouldn't be restrained. We should be free to do whatever we want with our arsenal. They distrust any arms control agreements because they think the bad guys will cheat and we'll keep approving them. And there's a lot of money involved. We spend about $100 billion on nuclear weapons every year. That's a big budget. That's $100 billion. That's a big market. You can then roll in the $30 billion on missile defense, and now Trump's Golden Dome, which is going to pile money on top of that. And you're probably looking at a market of about $150 billion, and companies are interested in that, and companies are driving that. And big nuclear has learned lessons from big pharma and big tobacco and big oil. They've learned how to penetrate the Washington space so that they have given good grants to think tanks in Washington, which is one of the reasons you don't see anti-nuclear papers coming out of the big think tanks in Washington, D.C. It's why you do see substantial proposals coming out of the conservative or pro-contractor institutes like the Heritage Foundation, who had a big nuclear section in their Project 2025 that Donald Trump is now implementing. And it's why you see the U.S. on a plan to replace every single weapon in our arsenal, every missile, every sub, every bomber, every warhead, with a brand new version at the cost of about $2 trillion. The Congressional Budget Office.
You've told us so many things. Hold on.
Oh, okay.
START is ending. This is incredible. I mean, this is just incredible. I just want to make sure people really grasp what you're saying because it's amazing. So the entire order of bilateral treaties is coming to an end. We're replacing our entire arsenal, and we've got a situation now where we've got a bunch of financial interests that are very, very difficult to overcome, right? Is that right?
Correct. That's right.
And explain to us why on earth we are replacing our entire arsenal. Is it broken, Joe? Does it need to be fixed?
Well, all weapons wear out. So it's true. At some point, you need to replace them, but do you have to replace them one-to-one? Or do you have to, as some of the proposals are, do you need to increase them? And the answer to that, particularly when it comes to the 400 land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles that we have in silos in the American Midwest, the answer to that is no. You actually don't need those anymore. You don't need that particular system anymore. You could eliminate it, and the United States would have ample nuclear forces in our bombers and in our strategic submarines to answer every conceivable current mission that we currently have. But the reason you are replacing it is that Northrop Grumman got a sole source contract, no competition, in the last month of the previous Trump administration, and this sweetheart deal has pushed right through Congress. The costs have doubled or almost tripled for what they said it was going to cost. So you got $175, maybe a $200 billion program just moving down the tracks for really no good strategic or military reason, but it's going to make Northrop Grumman and its subcontractors a pile of money.
And is this a Democrat-Republican issue, or is there support across the board for this?
You know, for the last 10 years or so, the pro-nuclear elements in Washington tried to create a consensus for modernization, bipartisan consensus to modernize the nuclear arsenal. What's wrong with modernizing, right? That sounds innocent
That
enough.
sounds
But
good.
what they
Yeah.
mean, what they mean is spending $2 trillion to build a whole new generation of weapons. And they succeeded
Mm.
for by basically rigging the system, suppressing dissent, flooding the zone with pro-nuclear studies, major political contributions to all the key Democratic and Republicans who sit on the oversight committees like the House Armed Services Committee, where I used to work, or the Appropriations Committee, or the leadership. They basically bought them all off. So at this point, there is a bipartisan consensus to continue spending $2 trillion to build new nuclear weapons. And there's a push now to revise our doctrines and strategies so that we could more easily use these weapons. So they're not simply for deterrence, they're for war fighting as well. That's the state of play right now. And to give you an example of whether there's a Republican, Joe Biden didn't do anything to change the Trump nuclear posture. Programs that Trump started continued under Biden. Biden didn't cut a dime of the budget. He didn't cancel any weapon. He didn't change any policy. So that tells you everything you need to know. At the top, that is our political leadership, there's complete support for this insane and very dangerous nuclear strategy.
Amazing. Interesting. And I want to ask you a question. Something I hear a lot is, well, the strategic environment has changed. It used to be that it was US, Russia, mainly. Now we have China as a new player. We don't understand them as well. They're much more unwilling to come to the bargaining table. So now we have to prepare ourselves to fight a nuclear war on multiple fronts at the same time. So we need more weapons. We need fancier weapons. And by the way, the public feels a lot more insecure now. The public in Korea and Japan, they're less anti-nuclear than they used to be, the same as in Germany. So the world has changed, and that's why. So what do you think about that?
Okay, so this is the main point of this talk, at least as far as I'm concerned. You may have had other plans,
Yeah,
but
great.
this is what I want to talk about. And this is nuclear weapons in the age of authoritarianism. If you look at nuclear policy articles, and it doesn't, whether you're looking at Foreign Affairs or you're looking at the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, you will see that the current trend is to talk about the fact that we're in a new nuclear age, that things have changed. We can go into the history of that phrase, but let's just say what people mean now. What they mean is that there are new conditions in the world that require us to develop new policies. And those new conditions roughly break out to new technologies, so frequently AI being involved in nuclear weapons. And for anyone who's seen Terminator, you know how that ends. But this is a push to get AI, I'm not kidding, to get AI involved, and the introduction of hypersonic vehicles, new stealth technologies, new kinds of delivery systems, all that. Then there's what you said, Annalise, there's the new proliferation threats. And we're faced with the prospects of not just countries that we used to call rogue nations, like Iran or North Korea getting nuclear weapons, but some of our allies, because of their distrust of the American president, that they can no longer rely on American security guarantees, or as the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, said yesterday, there's a rupture in the transatlantic alliance. People are looking at whether they need their own nuclear weapons or not. And then finally, there's the third, which is the increased great power rivalry. And what they mean by that is China is building up its nuclear arsenal. It's set to roughly double the nuclear weapons that it has, moving from about 300 to about 600. And some people project up to 1,000. Okay, well, now you have a new situation, they say, and that means we're in a new nuclear age. And what they mean by that, if you're in the center version of that, or the right-wing version of that, the heritage version, is that what we need to do is to match that with new nuclear weapons of our own and new use doctrines. So we would eliminate the red line that's been between conventional military and nuclear military. You would start integrating that and start bringing nuclear weapons, small tactical nuclear weapons, into conventional military use. I disagree with that. I think there's only one nuclear age, and that began 80 years ago, and that was the creation of machines that could kill large numbers of people at a distance instantly. And then the 10 years in the 40s and 50s, where we started an arms race, and we flooded the world with nuclear weapons, enough to end human civilization, within a few hours of their use. That is the fundamental condition of the nuclear age. And that hasn't changed for 80 years. The threat,
Yep.
the numbers have gone up, the numbers have gone down, the rivalries have intensified, there's been crises, but that is the fundamental characteristic. But what has changed now is the nature of the governments that control those nuclear weapons. And for the first time in the nuclear age, 7 of the 9 nations that hold nuclear weapons are led by authoritarian leaders. This has never happened before. And our theories weren't designed for this. Our thinking isn't designed for this, but it's what has happened. In other words, we got used to authoritarian countries like Russia and China, and then in this century, North Korea, acquiring nuclear weapons. But now those are authoritarian governments getting nuclear weapons. But now we have nuclear armed states acquiring authoritarian regimes. So when you look at what's changed, you realize that India, Pakistan with nuclear weapons have authoritarian leaderships. In some cases, I would say Pakistan is an authoritarian regime. India is getting very close. Israel, an authoritarian leader. And of course, the big one, the United States has an authoritarian leader. And if it comes up often in common conversation, like Trump's performance at Davos yesterday, everybody said this man is obviously mentally impaired. And many people will note, and he has his finger on the nuclear button. Exactly. He has his finger on the nuclear button. And this the same case is the same case with the other 7 authoritarian leaders. They all have the sole unfettered ability to launch nuclear weapons whenever they want. The only true democracies left are France and the United Kingdom, and who knows how long that's going to last.
Yeah.
So that's the issue we have to deal with. Those are the new risks, and we definitely need new theories and new approaches to counter those, in some ways, exponentially new nuclear threats to human civilization.
That's so important. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the entire paradigm that I was raised in, just kind of presumed democratic states, right? I mean, we never really thought much about it. That was just a given that it would be. And yes, we had somehow expanded the power of the president so that he had the nuclear button. But come on, nobody would, use that in a way that violated basic norms. And now we're in a situation where the norms are gone. I mean, one of the things that's so interesting about what you're saying to me is that on the one hand, authoritarianism changes nuclear weapons, but on the other hand, having nuclear weapons makes an authoritarian so much more powerful and so much more frightening, right? I mean, Trump with nuclear
Absolutely.
weapons is very different than Trump without nuclear weapons.
Absolutely. There's no question about it. And, this idea, in some ways, the fact that we were democracies was the bedrock that allowed us to justify their possession. Why would you have thousands of weapons that can kill tens of millions of people instantaneously? Why would you base your security on this threat of mass extinction? And you had people like Pope Francis, saying that is an immoral standard. You cannot base national security on the threat of mass extinction. And you've had religious leaders across the board warning about this. You had peace activists warning about this. But the answer was always, we have to have them. We won't use them, but we need them to deter the authoritarian regimes that do have them, and will stop at nothing and will use nuclear weapons to promote their conventional aggression. For example, the way Putin is using a nuclear umbrella to protect himself from retaliation in his invasion of Ukraine. The reason NATO hasn't gone in to Ukraine is because Putin has nuclear weapons. And they understand, as Joe Biden said, we don't want this to be World War III. So our justification is, we're the good guys, we're the Democrats, we have moral values, we treat life with respect, we won't do what the authoritarians do. Well, what does that do to your theory if suddenly you are the authoritarians? If your democracy is no longer a democracy, if you do not have morality that values other people's lives, what justification is there then for maintaining these arsenals?
I just want to add a little footnote, a little tweak to what you're saying from the point of view of people in the Pacific, the people that I've worked with since my dissertation, because, most Americans don't really realize, what happened in the Marshall Islands, what those tests have meant for an entire culture, entire civilization of folks who had to be displaced. And, from their point of view, they did experience authoritarianism from us, right? That they had no voice, they had no choice. And their kind of existence was not really taken seriously. Democracy didn't apply to them. So I think it's always good to remember that perhaps we were not as pure in our values before as we wish we were, but nevertheless, that was the theory, at least. I wonder
Well,
if there's, sorry, go ahead.
well, this is, this again, this remarkable speech by Mark Carney yesterday at
Yes,
Davos, and it's
yes,
well
yes,
worth watching or reading James
absolutely.
Fallows, who has a brilliant Substack on this yesterday, where he annotates the speech. Carney says we always knew that the so-called rules-based international order, or in this case, the U.S. possession of nuclear weapons for the purpose of deterrence, which is part of that order, which is part of the global security, was filled with hypocrisy and lies,
Yeah,
and that
yeah,
exceptions would be carved out.
yeah.
It wasn't, no one's above the law. No, no, we definitely used our nuclear weapons in ways that we would object to if other people did them that way. Backup threats, abused the people, like in particular the people of the Marshall Islands or the downwinders in Nevada and Utah, who suffered from our tests until very recently without a penny of compensation. So that we knew this, that there was always flaws in this, but basically the paradigm held. What I'm saying is the paradigm doesn't hold anymore.
Yeah,
That
yep,
this is what's fundamentally changed here, and this
yep,
is what we have to be
yep.
confronting. And in some ways, and maybe we'll get to this at the end, what it means is, if you're against nuclear weapons, you have to understand that this is part of the fight against authoritarianism. And if you're against authoritarianism, if you're part of this mass movement that is growing in our country, you have to understand that nuclear weapons play a role here, that is part of the authoritarians' power domestically and also globally. And our job here is to integrate this both sort of theoretically and then organizationally. And we can talk more about that later if you want.
Absolutely. So important. So, okay. So we have a question from Timothy I want to get to because I think it does
Hey,
go
great.
to something that, a lot of people would say listening to you, well, then if I'm a little democratic country, not little, mid-sized, Canada, Japan, Korea, what have you, I better get myself a nuclear weapon. That's the result of what you're saying is that if the big nuclear states are all authoritarian, the rest of us have the only way to survive is to get ourselves a nuclear weapon. And Timothy says, and had Ukraine not forfeited its nuclear weapons in 1994, it would be more powerful in the eyes of Russians. What do you think about that?
First of all, hi, Tim. Great to hear from you. And yes, we have to have lunch soon. That'd be great. Maybe when it's warmer and we can do it outside. But you're absolutely right. Few caveats to that, and one of them is it really wasn't possible for Ukraine to maintain its nuclear weapons. Remember, the Soviet Union had collapsed, and the Russia had nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, but they really weren't Ukrainian nuclear weapons. They were Russian
Hmm.
nuclear weapons. The Ukrainians didn't really control them in any real sense. They didn't know how to operate them. And in their economic condition, they really couldn't afford them. And most importantly, politically, if they hadn't given up those nuclear weapons, remember this was 94 or so, I
4.
think the deal
Hmm.
was reached, they would have been shunned by the European Union. And what they valued most was becoming part of the European Union,
But the
being part of
argument still applies, to, Taiwan was on its way to getting a nuclear bomb. I mean, a number of other states that could see this as the only possibility for small democracies to defend themselves.
Right. And the norm was, and especially in the 90s, we're all moving to reduce and get rid of our nuclear weapons. This is where
Yep,
everybody's going. The big
yep,
kids are doing this too. And that was
yep,
true,
yep,
more or less.
yep.
Well, it's not true now.
Hmm.
And you feel that you can no longer rely on your nuclear protector. One of the big selling points for having an arsenal as big as we do is that we were going to use this to protect our allies in Europe and Asia. But what if you're not going to protect your allies in Europe and Asia? What if you have an authoritarian that sees them as adversaries, not allies? And more importantly, you were saying, Lisa, and I'd like to hear what you think. What happens when those governments don't trust us anymore?
Hmm.
And you have even in Japan, but definitely in South Korea,
Yeah.
you see the publics start to say, "Hey, we're fools not to get these weapons. We cannot depend on the United States. We have to have these themselves." Do you hear those debates in Asia?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think that what's important for you and I to mention here is while it makes sense on the surface, in practice, it makes all of us a lot less safe if nuclear weapons proliferate, right? So in theory, it's a good idea, save myself by getting myself a nuclear weapon. But the more there are out there, the more chances of errors there are, the more chances of just mix-ups, problems of various kinds. Most near misses of a nuclear attacks have not been by purposeful launches, they've been because of mistakes, right? And so it's a problem that people like us need to argue against, I think, here. A new problem related to your changed conditions, the rise of authoritarianism. We're going to hear a lot more of this from the public.
Right. So in the 50s and 60s, we confronted this problem. That's why I say this is not new. In the 50s and 60s, when John F. Kennedy is debating Richard Nixon in the presidential debate, he warns that if we don't do something, in the next 10 years, we'll go from 4 nuclear weapon states, which is what they had then. China hadn't tested yet. 4 nuclear weapon states to 15, 20, or 25. And that came from a CIA estimate that he had seen. I write about this in one of my books, that showed that there were somewhere between 15 and 25 countries that were interested in and could technologically get nuclear weapons.
Yes.
And most of those were our allies. They weren't the bad guys, although they were there too. It was Japan, it was Korea, it was Germany, it was Switzerland, it was Finland, it was Norway, it was Australia. So our answer to that was to develop an international framework, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that whole related series of agreements and security guarantees that struck a bargain that said, okay, you guys will not get nuclear weapons. And in exchange, we promise that we will reduce our arsenals and eventually eliminate them. And by the way, while that's happening, we, the United States, will give you security guarantees so that you don't have to get your own. And that worked. Even as the United States and Russia didn't actually disarm. For a couple of decades later, until they limited in 70s, they started to disarm in the late 80s. And now that agreement is in danger of breaking again because nobody trusts the United States. And they see that the big guys are starting to build up again. And so we're faced with the 50s, 60s problem all over again. And the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is part of the international community's effort to try to solve that, to try to get back to that bargain where you start moving the world in a non-nuclear direction again. And we're at that inflection point where it could go either way at this point. It's not guaranteed that we're off to a new arms race, although we're in it. And so the struggle is over which point of view will prevail.
Yeah. So Mark Benke is asking a question about the Golden Dome. And I do think it's relevant here because one response to this rising authoritarianism would be to say we need to play better defense. We need to build better defensive systems. Could you talk a little bit about the Golden Dome and whether it is an effective strategy or not, and a cost-effective strategy or not for us?
National Missile Defense is the longest running scam in the history of the Department of Defense. And Golden Dome is just the latest version of selling this snake oil. We do not have the ability to shoot down a long-range ballistic missile headed for the United States. We can, and this is remarkable, shoot down short-range missiles like Scuds or drones or attacking Ukraine or rockets like Hamas was firing at Israel. You can do that. Short range, lower speeds, within the atmosphere. It's the advances over the last 20 years, or basically since the 1991 Iraq War, have been remarkable. We can do that. But when you go to long-range ballistic missiles, things that can span the ocean, that have a brief period of powered flight, fly through outer space, and then come back down at like 7 kilometers a second, you can't hit that. Well, let me be more precise. Sometimes, under perfect conditions, you can hit that. But sometimes isn't good enough for a reliable defense against nuclear weapons.
And in the meantime, it just encourages your adversary to do the same, to build greater missile systems, and it costs a heck of a lot of money. So when we talk about inequality in this country, and we talk about affordability, and we talk about taxes and all these things, folks need to think about what are the trade-offs with some of these systems that don't work, I think.
Yeah. One of the experts over at the American Enterprise Institute, no liberal institute, estimated that Golden Dome, to have a chance at being successful, would cost about $2 trillion, and you'd have to put thousands of interceptor satellites, tens of thousands of interceptor satellites in orbit to have a chance of providing a defense for the country. It is ludicrous. It will not work. It will never work. I feel confident in saying that. And as you say, Annalise, if you try to do that, the response of our adversary is what offenses always do when confronted with defenses. You increase the offense. You build up your offense. So the easiest way to counter a defense system that does work some of the time is to overwhelm it with numbers, because it's cheaper to add offensive warheads than it is to add defensive systems. And that is basically what China is doing. Why is China going from 300 to 600 and maybe 1,000? Because it sees the United States building a whole new generation of nuclear weapons and promising that it's going to have a missile defense system that's going to be able to neutralize China's small force. So the obvious answer to that is to build up your force. We see what China's doing, but we don't see what we have done to trigger China's response. We only see one side of the dynamic, but unless you understand the whole thing, you don't have any clue of coming up with a solution to it.
So then the question is, what can we do? And, I mean, as a lawyer, to me, one of the places we might think about starting, I want to hear what you know as a real expert, is it has to do with Trump's unilateral power to launch a nuclear attack. I mean, it's not based in law. It's really based in convention. It could be changed quite easily by statute. And it was created in a time, as I understand it, when telecommunications were really difficult. There was a thought that the president could be isolated in a moment of attack and there wouldn't be any way for anyone else to make a decision. But we're no longer in that world now. And it seems that when we have authoritarians running things, one of the things we could focus on is maybe restricting their powers. What do you think?
I think that's the single most important policy change we could achieve. And I say that in some sadness, because I believe that the most important thing to do is to eliminate nuclear weapons. But if all the arms control organizations in the United States had perfect cooperation, which they do not, and mobilized all their resources, which are meager, they couldn't cut $50 from the nuclear budget. The game is just stacked against us. It's just, there are 770 defense contractor lobbyists in the United States. It's an enormous amount of money going to push these contracts, push these programs forwards. And it says, you haven't seen a reasonable change in U.S. nuclear policy in, I would say, about 11 years. The last big change was the Iran deal of 2015, which I played a role in helping to support. And then that was overturned by Trump. That's it. That's the last time there was any change of any kind in U.S. nuclear policy, including proliferation and our own weapon systems. So you have a problem. What can you actually do? And it's not a question of finding the right slogan or finding the right message or hiring some consultant or getting some rich guy to give you $1 million. No. I've done all that. I did all those things. So, but what you can do is you could convince an American president who is open to this idea, and I think that would have to be a Democratic president, most likely, to change nuclear policy. This is the president's prerogative. He sets the policy. He doesn't need Congress to do it. He doesn't need legislation to do it. The next president of the United States could say, we're eliminating sole authority, because right now, president and only the president can launch nuclear weapons, and no one can contradict him. As long as it's a legal order, and he's got a briefcase full of legal orders, full of legal options. And if you saw Catherine Bigelow's film, House of Dynamite, you saw the briefcase and you saw the range of orders that go from rare to well done, as the launch officer said. No one can stop him. He doesn't need the approval of the Joint Chiefs. The Joint Chief Chairman isn't even in the chain of launch authority. He doesn't need the Secretary of Defense to agree. Or the Vice President or the Speaker of the House. Nobody. We could change that. Absolutely. And if you change that, at the very least, you solve the madman problem. Having seen this country elect Donald Trump twice, I don't think this is going to be the last time we are confronted with a crazy authoritarian leader. So when we have the chance, for God's sakes, let's fix that. Let's at least solve that part of the problem. Require other people to agree to the launch. Or there's a bill in Congress right now that's got 20 co-sponsors that says that you have to give 7 days notice of the intent to use a nuclear weapon first, not in response to an attack. But if the president wants to use a nuclear weapon, he has to notify Congress, which, after all, is the only body that is legally, constitutionally authorized to declare war. And using a nuclear weapon would certainly be a declaration of war.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So how would we actually go about moving this forward? I mean, you're somebody who's worked a lot on pressure campaigns. How do we get this from off the ground?
Well,
Is it
there's
a bill in Congress? What has to happen?
well, there,
You think we have to
yes,
wait
you have
till
to
an
have
election?
you have to have legislative champions. I would say there's three levels of this, and first is like an
Yeah,
expert level, getting
yeah,
experts to focus on this problem and make
yes,
concrete
yes,
recommendations. It doesn't
yes,
have to be a whole heritage
yes,
project 2025 type thing, but to build the expert consensus that yes, you can do this. Here are the various options for doing it, and you're not crazy to think that this is a problem. This is a real problem. The second thing to do is to find serious legislative champions who can start pushing this now. And as I say, there are some already in Congress. The third is to then work with the president, with the campaigns in over the next few years to bring this in. But the real key, when you do all that, you're going to need mass pressure to do that. And the only way the United States
yeah,
has reduced nuclear weapons is because of civilian protests and pressure.
yep,
This is
yep,
the only way it's done. It's what motivated Kennedy. It's what changed Reagan's mind. You know, it's what motivated Barack Obama to seek the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons. Big movements. And what are the big movements now? I know people keep thinking we can reestablish an anti-nuclear movement like we had in the 80s. That's just not going to happen. I'd like to hear what you think about that, Annalise, but there are mass movements going on. And the biggest
yes,
mass movement in American history is happening right now, and it's the No Kings movement and
yes,
related movements
yes.
moving against what? Against authoritarianism. You got to, the groups that care about this issue have to find ways to merge with them, not to give them a demand that they do something about this, but to bring, however meager their assets, into this fight, to understand that the struggle against authoritarianism is also a struggle for nuclear restraint and for nuclear elimination. And that, imagine what it would be like if the No Kings demonstrations next year included
Included a
demands that we reduce the
discussion.
nuclear budget,
Yay.
save ourselves from nuclear madness, that no king should be able to start a nuclear war, right? I mean, it's right
Absolutely.
there.
Absolutely.
You just
And
need
that's why
people to
I'm just
start.
so thankful for all 50 of you who are on this call right now. I think this is a real call
Geez,
to
really?
action. Folks, feel free to put your questions or comments or reactions to this because I think, this could be the beginning of a strategy here, which how do we mobilize much more broadly? You're absolutely right, Joe, that it requires experts and policy papers, but it also requires ordinary folks at all levels. And I think it's really important to remember that African American activists, folks like Martin Luther King, were some of our great advocates for nuclear disarmament. Feminists have long
Absolutely.
been great advocates for nuclear disarmament, put it right at the center of their work. Indigenous folks really are very, very concerned because so much of the testing has been on Indigenous land. Just footnote, I've been disappointed that there hasn't been more discussion of the Indigenous folks in Greenland who are being talked about as if they're just pawns in this game one way or another of, putting weapons on their land as if they have no voice in that. I'd like to hear from them on this actually quite directly. But in any case, I think your idea of making this the center of a intersectional social movement is really, really important. And maybe that brings us to today, the TPNW, because today is the anniversary of the treaty coming into force. If folks don't know, I mean, this treaty is really interesting to me as an international lawyer because it has many, many countries that are signatories. Most of them are countries that used to be colonized, that are in the global south, that are not they're not the nuclear powers. They are not even in the nuclear umbrella. And it has a perspective. It has a kind of a post-colonial perspective, this treaty. It has an argument about justice. It talks about nuclear justice compensating the folks who've been victims. And it's really pretty much poo-pooed by a lot of the establishment, in my view, at least. It's kind of like, oh,
Oh, yeah.
well, it's just like a kind of this little thing that they're doing. What does it matter? But at the same time, it's having effects. And, one of the effects that I find really fascinating has to do with those nuclear weapons companies you were talking about. There's really only a handful of big companies that produce weapons. How many is it, Joe? Is it like 37 or something? It's not that many, right?
No, it's not that many.
In
There's
that
really there's the
range.
5 big guys, and then there's
Yeah.
their major subcontractors. But it's right.
It's a
It's
small
2 to 3
group.
dozen.
And
Yeah,
then we've got about 250 financial firms that invest in those companies. So that's the ecosystem of where the money's coming from. Now, this
yeah.
treaty says that it is illegal under the terms of the treaty for any state actor or non-state actor to invest in nuclear weapons. And so what we're seeing happening now is that under EU law, international law is incorporated into their corporate social responsibility standards. And so we're seeing quite a few companies now saying, wait a minute, if we go do business in Europe, and these are big companies like Halliburton, they've got like a million different kinds of businesses, some of which have nothing to do with nuclear weapons, right? And they're saying, well, wait a minute, but we could be sanctioned in the EU because we're doing something over here that's considered in violation of international law. And the result is that the number of companies that are, especially on the investment side, that are investing in weapons has gone down considerably. And that's interesting. I mean, that's a concrete, tangible effect of this law, right? Of this treaty. And there are others too. I mean, I was at a meeting of the state parties last year and was just so touched to see folks from the Pacific Islands meeting up with people from the downwinders from New Mexico and really seeing themselves as having something in common that they had not really understood before that treaty, right? And talking about their shared experiences. There were women talking about what it means to be pregnant and be worried that your child is going to have some sort of deformity because you were exposed to this, and just the tears and the tears of recognition of each other, and realizing that what this treaty is doing is creating a new community of affected communities and connecting them, and who knows where that leads in the future, but it's something for now. So I don't know. What do you think about the treaty, Joe?
In this century, there have been only 3 successful public campaigns to change nuclear policy. The first was New START, and so it's supporting something the administration wants to do, but it requires public to build the political space so that senators will vote for that treaty. I was involved in that effort when I was the head of the Plowshares Fund, and we built a coalition of NGOs to help do that. The second was the Iran nuclear deal. Again, helping an administration do something they wanted to do. We helped build a coalition of support for that. Those were the last 2 substantial changes in U.S. policy. We haven't seen anything, the only successful ones in this century. The third is the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And U.S. activists played a very small role in that. They were there, but it was mainly
right.
Europeans, Asian, South Americans, Latin Americans. And they started this series of humanitarian consequences conferences. And I went to one in Vienna in 2014. It was like something that was, I'm an American. I care about American policy. What are these guys playing with over there? It blew my mind. They had representatives from several dozen countries at high levels engaged in the discussions of this. I walked into a room of the what they call civil society meetings, the NGOs, and there was like 200 people there. When I walked in, I substantially raised the average age of that group. And they were all shades of human beings in that room. This was a complete shock to me, and it real shattered my American arrogance. Yeah. And I said, something's going on here. I don't know what it is, but we got to be part of this. And Plowshare started to help fund that event. As a result, Beatrice Finn, the head of the ICAN, International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, won the Nobel Peace Prize along with Habakisha from Japan. And I got to go to the Peace Prize ceremony in Oslo.
Oh, lucky you.
When they got the prize in
that's incredible.
Wow. I think it was 2017.
Well, I think you deserve it too. But in any case.
Yeah, let me go get my prize. I think Beatrice gave it to me.
Speaking of peace prizes, there's a question here from Bob. He says, is there a chance that the Trump's Board of Peace can take on disarmament? And can we convince the Nobel Peace Prize Committee to add a new category, nuclear disarmament? What do you think?
Well, just this year, the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize is an anti-nuclear activist. They've done it again. They've awarded, I think, 5 or 6 times in their career, they've awarded the Peace Prize to nuclear activists, including the international
Pugwash,
physicians.
right?
Yeah, and
Yes.
Pugwash, right. So this has happened, and they care about this. The Nobel Committee, which is not controlled by Norway, does indeed care about this. And I think that so can the Board of Peace take. I think the Board of Peace is another Trump scam. I mean, this is a hustle, man. And it was humiliated yesterday when I think 20 countries showed up for his meeting. None of the major European countries joined. Even Israel didn't show up to join. This is a hustle. This is not something we should support in any way or be looking for some kind of leverage. Is it possible that at some point Trump could pull a Reagan? Trump could decide that he really wants to make a deal and he's running out of options and he could convince Putin to do some kind of nuclear. Yes, it's possible. He might also be able to strike a deal with North Korea. I just think it's improbable, and it's not where you want to place your chips. It could happen.
Yeah.
That's a high risk strategy because of the nature of the man and what moves him. And you're better off working the other side of the road. That's got a better chance of building a sustainable movement that can support these kinds of goals.
Totally agree. And, let's remember also that Reagan didn't just take that decision all by himself. There were 2 million people in Central Park at that time demonstrating for nuclear disarmament, right? And so there was a massive social movement that changed the spirit of things that I think must have had some impact on his thinking. Right?
Yes. I mean, and he wrote about this actually. That at that point, this is the 1982 demonstration in Central Park, was the largest demonstration in U.S. history. Later eclipsed by the Women's March, and now eclipsed further by the No Kings marches. But it did really affect Trump, Reagan, who always did have a nuclear abolition part of himself. In the 40s, he joined anti-nuclear protests before the studios told him not to. And he wrote in one of his memoirs that he didn't think he could ever push the button, that even if we were under attack, if the missiles were coming in, he didn't think he could push the button. What's the point, he said. So there was a moral core to Reagan that I didn't appreciate as a Democrat working on Capitol Hill against the Reagan policies in the 80s. Yeah. I didn't appreciate until really after he had left office, after Reykjavik, after a start began, that he was serious. It wasn't a scam. We don't have a president like that now.
Absolutely. And that's what I've been so interested to see the faith community's role at this moment, right? I mean, the Holy See was the first to sign on to the TPNW, interestingly, and some of the positions taken by church leaders lately have been quite impressive. But not just the Catholics. You have leadership coming from Jewish groups, from Muslim groups, across the spectrum. And perhaps, I think sometimes our leftist activist groups aren't that good at forging alliances with religious communities. Maybe that's a place where we can do some work. What do you think?
The U.S. Catholic Bishops Conference. Yes, they're quite good at this. And they got a pretty big grassroots movement.
Yeah, no kidding.
And when they speak from the pulpit, I mean, they move people. So this is real. And the Catholic Church, like the Anglican Church, the Episcopalian Church, as you say, major Jewish leaders believe that nuclear weapons are immoral. And the church changed its position. They always believed that nuclear weapons were immoral, but they gave sort of a cutout to deterrence, and they believe, there was a role here, and is the moral value of deterring somebody's attack worth it? And then during these conferences on the humanitarian consequences, the Vatican came out with a paper and said, no, it's no longer enough, because the nuclear weapon states show that they're not serious about this, that this is a scam as well, and that it takes away treasure from governments that could be going to satisfying real human needs, and bases your national security strategy on the threat of mass annihilation. And that is fundamentally immoral. You cannot base a just society on that kind of threat. That's what religious leaders say constantly. By the time that message gets to Washington, it's just ignored. It's just pushed aside. It's one of the things we don't discuss when we discuss nuclear weapons. We don't discuss cost. We don't discuss morality. We don't discuss consequences. We don't discuss targeting. Why do you need so many? It's one of the many things that are just shunted aside in order to have the conversation be about deterring the other guy, or matching a niche in the escalatory ladder, or this capability we can develop, so shouldn't we develop it? But when you have a full and you are involved in these kinds of discussions, but people don't have a political or financial stake in nuclear weapons, you get the whole picture and you get a more realistic idea of why these weapons are such a threat and why having them in the hands of authoritarian leaders is such a risk to the continuation of human civilization.
No kidding. Absolutely.
And it's
Well,
why next week the Volta of Atomic Scientists is going to reset their clock. And there's no doubt in my mind that minute hand is going to inch even closer to midnight because the risks are growing. It is more dangerous now than it was last year. And the trade trends are continuing. That's going to be true for next year as well. So
absolutely.
the
And
need for
as
people to
somebody,
get involved, to do something like you do, Annalise, it's never been more urgent.
and one of the things, spending time in Nagasaki, I think I certainly didn't understand until I spent time there what this is all really like, what we're actually talking about here, what happens underneath a mushroom cloud. And I think that it's such a critical moment because the folks um, who've experienced this firsthand are not going to be with us in 5 or 6 years anymore, right? So this is the
Yes.
moment for everyone to learn everything you can and to really hear from those folks firsthand, and to just really educate ourselves about the humanitarian human consequence, what we're talking about doing to ourselves and to other human beings. Because that's what this is really about, not war games, not technical stuff. That's what it's about. So we're going to have to stop here. But Joe, I want people to feel there's something they can do. What would you suggest? If I'm listening to this conversation, I'm thinking, yeah, absolutely, and I want to take a next step, what would you recommend?
One thing, since you're all Substackers, is to subscribe to the people that are on Substack that are discussing these issues and give them some love. So that's number one. Two, I would just put it. I don't expect anybody here to make this their number one issue, but in the complex of things that you worry about, the storms coming, are we going to have a country in 3 years or not? Nuclear weapons should be one of those issues. Just bring it in there and try to find a group that speaks to you on this issue. Some of my favorites are like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, a place where you can get news and thoughtful discussion about this. You may be a more positions for social responsibility person. You may be more of a think tanker, and so pay attention to the Carnegie Endowment project or the Council on Livable World. I'm on their board. Okay, that's just stuff that you can do that's sort of passive. Get yourself involved, keep informed. If you have any interactions with any legislative elected leader, and it's that time of year, right? They're all calling, they're all texting, bring it up. Bring it up to them. They got to hear this. I sit on a couple of boards where we interview people. I just interviewed a member of Congress yesterday looking for the endorsement of the Council for Livable World, and she has a very good record on opposing excessive nuclear spending, opposing Golden Dome. Well, they have to hear that this gives them traction, that they get something out of this. When John F. Kennedy passed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1962, he was campaigning that year on the stump for congressional candidates. And every time he mentioned that treaty, he got wild applause. And he quipped, if I'd known it was so popular, I would have done it a long time ago.
Absolutely.
That's what our politicians have to hear. That's the kind of stuff that you can do without a big commitment or a change of life.
Absolutely. And folks, so many cities, communities, towns, villages are passing their own resolutions encouraging the US to change its policy. So that's something you can look up online. I think Back from the Brink
or for towns to change their investment strategies,
or
pull
their
money from
even
the pension
more,
accounts
even more
out
to
of
change their
yes. nuclear contractors.
Absolutely.
I don't invest in nuclear contractors. It's not that hard to find investments that can give you a very nice return, but do not support weapons production.
And ICANN has a great document on their website, icanw.org, where they tell you which companies, how to invest if you don't want your portfolio to include that. So it's something you can do. Getting involved locally. And if you'd like to learn more about the perspective on these issues, international law from the perspective of Nagasaki, I'm going to try something unusual this year. I'm going to teach a 6-week online course from Nagasaki. It's what I teach in my law school class, but just for public audience and bring in folks on the ground as part of that. So happy to have you join that as well. And in general, stay in touch because there's a lot going on in this space, and I think it's not always visible to us. But for now, I just want to say, Joe, thank you from all of us for what you've done across your career, for the leadership you provide, the sanity you bring to all this, and just it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you, Annalise, for everything you're doing and for hosting this event or getting me to host it. That's a good organizer. That's the key to organizing. Get somebody else to do the work. Excellent. So, but for those people who came in late, tell me, is this going to be posted again? Can they view this?
So we will put all this out on both of our Substacks, I believe, right, Joe? So we'll let
if you tell me to do it, I will do it.
Okay, the
Yes.
replay so that you can listen to it all online. And we'll also put some shorter clips so that you can catch some of the highlights. And please, let's try to, maybe if we cross subscribe, we can also try to get some of your information, Joe, in front of my audience because people would like to read about what you're up to. So take
Great.
care,
I
everyone.
will do
Thank
that.
you for being here. And
Thank you all for coming, especially
to be
my neighbors who
continued.
just signed on. Thank you very much.